Great to be with you today and just having a great time. I remember when I was 5 years old, it was just another regular day for a 5-year-old, but it was a huge day for me because it means I got to go to the grocery store. Now, not a lot of excitement as an old guy going to the grocery store, but when you're 5 years old, grocery store, prime time, because you're with mom and you got to help mom out because she doesn't realize what you really need from the store. And so I was doing that. Doing what every American young kid should do, helping mom fill the cart with all the good stuff like cookies and crackers. I was running all over the store finding things because at that age you can kind of let your kids wander. Maybe mom just let me wander, I'm not sure. But I was wandering and then I realized that mom was lost. Come on, Mom. I couldn't find her. I looked for like minutes and maybe felt like hours up and down the aisles, running around, and finally I saw her. And my little 5-year-old body, as fast as I could, ran, and jumped and just leaped and grabbed her leg and hugged her. And then I looked up, and it wasn't Mom. What a horrible feeling to look up and it not be Mom, it being this strange lady who smiled and laughed, and I began to I was desperate. You ever been desperate? I was on my first trip with DCPI. I'd been at the organization for about 3 months, and they asked me if I wanted to go to Italy. Well, there's only one answer: yes, I want to go to Italy. The guy who'd been there for 15 years of the company, he was going to Sudan. New guy going to Italy. I felt like I won. I'm in Italy, and I'm there meeting my friends. I'm in Rome the first day and spent the day kind of doing the tourist thing, being the ugly American, and having lots of fun enjoying. And the next day, I got onto a bus to get to a train to get to Florence to meet my friend in Florence for a training of church planners we were going to have there. And so as I got up in the morning, I did the best I could with my package. I got my suitcase. I grabbed all my things. I put my backpack in my front so I didn't get anything stolen. I put my passport and my wallet in my front pockets, and I walked to the bus. It was a little bus. And when I got there, the line was long. I'm the only American in line, and these guys are so nice. They're like letting me go in front of them. Like, oh, please go. I heard a lot about ugly American. I felt like, hey, blessed American. And I got up to the front, and the guy helped me on the bus. I got on the back of the bus. It was packed, and I'm leaning against the back wall as the bus takes off. And I realized I no longer had a wallet or a passport. I'm an American in Italy on a bus surrounded by a bunch of Italian guys, so helpful that people let me on the bus, but had no idea that I was now without money, without identification, without a passport, and I was on day 2 of this trip that was going to be a 10-day trip. I was desperate. I was a freshman in college. 18 years old. It was January, I think it was the 3rd. It was a Sunday. And we sat with our college group at a church I was a part of, and they asked us that day to write a letter. I thought that was kind of weird. They said, write a letter to God. I thought, that's even stranger. Why don't I just talk to him? But write a letter to God, and on the envelope, write down your address. That's kind of weird. You don't know God's address? Okay, I'll write that down. I'm writing a letter. They said, here's what I want you to do. I want you to write and tell God what you would like to see happen this year. So I sat there for what felt like hours, knowing everyone's writing stuff, and I've got nothing to write. And I realized that I was tired of being a religious kid. I was 18, and I believed in God. I kind of knew he was there, but I was also realizing that I'd been kind of playing this game, and I was tired of it. I was just sick of doing the right thing to do the right thing. And as I wrote down to God, I said, God, I believe in you, but I'm tired of being a Christian. I wondered if I get zapped down and killed, but I didn't, so I kept writing. And I told him how I felt, that I was tired of playing a game. I was tired of doing the right thing because it was the right thing to do. I was tired of just being a good kid. I needed him to show up, or I just didn't want to follow him anymore. I was going to do my own thing. I was desperate. Being desperate's a hard place because when you're desperate, you do the craziest things. The great news is this. The book we've been looking through, the book of John, is filled with Jesus showing up time after time after time with desperate people. We started in John 2, and we see that he's up in Galilee. And he's actually in the city of Cana, where there's a wedding going on, and there's a group of desperate people. In John 2, we hear about Jesus' mom being concerned because they'd run out of wine. And there was great embarrassment for the family. So Jesus, seeing the family was desperate, did something incredible. He turned water into wine. Jesus showed up and made a party happen. Desperate people, and Jesus shows up. From there, Jesus goes over about 20 miles over to Capernaum with his family and hangs out with them for a few days. Then he takes another trip. Jesus is always traveling. He's up in Capernaum along the Sea of Galilee, and he travels 85 miles all the way down south to Jerusalem. That was the main hub of everything that was going on. And he traveled not because he had nothing better to do, because he had an appointment. You don't see it in John chapter 2, but he's got an appointment to show up. And he shows up, and maybe you were here when Chase spoke about that. He showed up, and the crowd went in the temple was kind of going crazy. And Jesus was angry at the temple because the temple was supposed to be a place where people could meet God, but they'd made it into a market. And so in John 2, you see Jesus puts together this big whip and drives and flips over tables and kind of just goes nuts for a little bit. But not actually nuts. He's seeing desperate people and they need a desperate act. And then that one of the evenings he was there was a guy named Nicodemus who was desperate. Nicodemus was a religious leader. He was part of the Pharisees. He was the guy that you'd want to be when you grew up if you were a young Jewish boy. But you knew you couldn't reach that, but that's like your hero. He was the one who explained all the things of God. He had all the right answers. And yet Nicodemus was desperate. He was so confused because he'd heard about Jesus. He may have heard about or seen or been a part of this transformation of water into wine. He heard about he went through the temple and flipped things over and was doing amazing things. And he wondered, how do I get to know this guy? Jesus traveled from Jerusalem back up toward Galilee, but it said that he had to go through Samaria. Now, you heard last week, he didn't really have to go through Samaria. But the Bible said he had to go through Samaria. And he had to go through Samaria because he had an appointment. There was a woman who was desperate. There was a woman that he would meet that day in the middle of the day gathering water at a well. That sounds normal to us, but it wasn't normal for that day because women would gather water in the morning when it was cool. But for some reason, in the middle of the day, as Jesus went through Samaria, traveled that 30 miles, he showed up and here's a woman who's gathering water, and he discovers that she's desperate. She's gathering water during the day because no one likes her. She's an outcast. She has no connection. And Jesus meets with her. Jesus from there stayed for a couple days and transformed the city. And then he went on his way to Galilee. Traveling another 30 miles, he shows up back in Cana where the wedding took place. He's met all kinds of desperate people along the way. And when he gets there, it's like the carnivals come to town. They've heard Jesus is coming, and they're so stoked that they get to see Jesus, the guy who had driven out the temple, the guy who turned water into wine, the guy who seemed like he could do anything. And they were like, hey, pony, show us a trick. It was a carnival. They wanted to see it, and so a crowd gathered. But Jesus didn't go to see a crowd. Jesus had an appointment with someone else. It says in John chapter 4, verse 44, Jesus himself had pointed out that a prophet has no honor in his own country. When he arrived in Galilee, back there in Cana, the Galileans welcomed him. They had seen all that he had done in Jerusalem at the Passover festival, for they had also been there. Once more he visited Cana in Galilee, where he had turned water into wine, and there was a certain royal official whose son lay sick in Capernaum. 20 miles away along the Sea of Galilee was where the son was. When this man heard that Jesus had arrived in Galilee from Judea, he went to him and begged Jesus to come and heal his son who was close to death. This man was a Roman officer. He was military. He had people who followed him because of his authority. He was a centurion, meaning he was in charge of 100 people. He always got things done. But today, he's desperate. Because 20 miles from where he's at, his son is dying. As a dad, you can take most anything away from me, don't mess with my kids. In that moment, most of us would say, I'm running home, but he didn't run home. He was so desperate that he went to Jesus. That's how desperate he was. And he begs him to come and heal his son, who is close to death. Now you see in verse 48 that Jesus responds to that. Jesus is there, the crowd is here, and the man yells out, would you please come heal my son? And Jesus replies, unless you people see signs and wonders, you'll never believe. Unless you people see signs and wonders, you'll never believe. The question comes from the Roman official, the royal official. But Jesus doesn't say this back to him. He says it to the people. It's actually the second person plural. It's like Jesus became Texas and said, hey, y'all, not you, all y'all, unless you see a sign and a miracle, you'll never believe. Still engage with the man, but letting them know, hey guys, I know you're here for a trick. Unless you see a sign, you'll never believe. The royal official said, sir, come down before my son dies. Like Nicodemus and like the woman at the well, this man is desperate. He needs help, but he can't find it. So he comes to Jesus and says, please come heal my son. I put my trust in a lot of things. We put our trust in things like Nicodemus did. Nicodemus put his trust in religion, and it worked until it didn't work anymore. The woman at the well put her trust in relationships, in sexual encounters, and it worked until it didn't work anymore. And the royal officials, like me, he put his trust in his family, and it worked until it didn't work anymore. When what we put our trust in doesn't work, when it doesn't show up, when it doesn't deliver, we become desperate. Desperate like a little boy in a grocery store grabbing onto a woman's legs and looking up and realizing that it's not mom. Desperate like a ugly American in the back of a bus realizing, oh no, I've got no money and no ID and no passport to get me out of this place. Desperate like a 18-year-old student trying to write a letter to God and trying to be honest, but not even sure if God was even seeing it. Nicodemus, the woman at the well, the royal official, they were desperate. So I guess what I want to do today is give you some good news. And here's the good news. You're not as far from God as you think. Hear that? You're not as far from God as you think. You may think, I'm miles away, but you're not as far away from God as you think. Nicodemus felt like he was miles from God. All his life, he'd been doing the right thing. He had read the Torah. He had studied scriptures. He had all the answers. And suddenly he goes, I feel like I'm miles from God. All my belief system is shattered. My community is looking at me and I'm a fake. I'm miles from God. The woman at the well felt like she was miles from God. She was alone at the well, gathering water. No one liked her. She was a homewrecker in that community. She had gone through 5 husbands, and number 6, she wondered if he would stick around. She had no connection, no relationship, and Jesus shows up, and at that moment, she is miles from God. Nicodemus was actually one conversation away from God. The woman at the well, one conversation away from God. And the royal official, he was 20 miles away from the thing that he loved most, his son. But the distance between he and his son was nothing compared to the distance that he felt between he and God. Have you ever been desperate? When Chase asked if I'd speak this morning, I said, sure, I'd love to. Looked at the text, that's a great story. I'd love to tell a story about a boy getting healed. That sounds great. And it wasn't until last night, that's how thick I am. Last night, I'm sitting in my car as I pulled in my driveway, and I realized it's May 1st tomorrow. May 1st, 2019, I wasn't in Vista, I was in Tanzania. I was on a trip helping to train leaders to plant churches. It'd been an amazing trip planned. I'd been there about 6 or 7 times, so I was meeting with some of the same guys, excited to be there. On Friday, I arrived. On Saturday, I got sick. On Sunday morning, I was feeling very sick. My wife was speaking at a women's retreat, Anthem's women's retreat, doing a seminar. And she got up, and she doesn't normally have this feeling, but she said, guys, I'm scared. If you know my wife, she's not scared of anything. But she was scared. She said, I feel like my husband's in danger. Can we just stop and pray for him right now? Having no idea that I was sick, having no idea how sick I was, I flew from Tanzania the following week back home, and I stopped in Texas for a little retreat with some of our leaders. My boss was there. My boss looked at me and said, you've got to get on a plane and fly home now. I was sick, but I didn't realize how sick I was. The next morning, I got home, and I wanted to sleep. My wife had work that morning. She said, Jake, my son, you've got to take Dad to the urgent care. My son's 17. At that point, I could still overpower him. Not today, but at that point, I could have still said no. But he got me into the truck, got me to the urgent care. I sat with the doctor. We took some blood work tests. The doctor came in about an hour later and said, well, I've got good news. You don't have a virus, but your kidneys are in failure. What? That happens with old people, right? Now, I realized I was old, but I didn't feel that old, and I'd been healthy. I'd just been sick. I thought I had some kind of fever or some kind of sickness. Didn't realize that I was so dehydrated that my kidneys finally said, Scott, we're stopping. The blood work showed that my kidneys were totally out of whack. They were actually in failure. I got in the car because the doctor said, you're going to the hospital now, Scott. I said, well, wait, can I talk to you? He said, no more discussion, Mr. Kirk. You are going now. If you don't go, I'll get an ambulance, but your wife is taking you now. On the way, my wife was talking to her brother, who is a doctor. Great to have a doctor in the family, usually. His name is Scott, and Scott was asking Kathy, well, what is his creatinine score? And she's looking through the paperwork. He said, well, it's 15.2. He said, no, it's impossible. He'd be dead. I'm sitting in the passenger seat. I hear this, and I said, Scott. And he goes, oh, I didn't know you were there. Scott, am I going to die? No, you're not going to die. But you're pretty jacked up. Let's get you to the hospital. Let's get some fluids in your body, and let's see how your body recovers. I got to the hospital. The nephrologist came in. He said, I wanted to see you, Scott. You're impressive. Your scores are impressive. I thought, well, thank you. I don't want to be impressive. I just want to kind of be home and hanging out on a couch. He pulled my wife into the hallway and told her, we just need to see how Scott recovers. And he was very frank. He said, we just need to hope that he makes it through the night. Desperate, sitting in a hospital bed knowing that I can't control anything, but I'm sitting there wondering what in the world is going on. My daughter, who's a sophomore in college, calls mom and says, how's Dad? I hear on speakerphone, is Dad going to die? I don't want to hear my 19-year-old daughter asking that question. She leaves her finals and comes home. My son comes and visits me every day. Chase shows up. When the pastor shows up and you're in the hospital, that's not always a good sign. He didn't have a suit on, so I knew it was okay, at least for now. But I was desperate. When you're desperate, you do the craziest things. Here's the truth, though. Jesus bridges the gap. That's who he is. He shows up, and you're not as far away from God as you think you are. You're actually just a conversation away. And Jesus is the kind of God who comes and bridges the gap. See, distance wasn't a barrier for Jesus with the royal official's son. He actually healed him long distance. Jesus didn't go to Capernaum. He just healed him with a word. He said, your son will live. That's cool that Jesus, distance doesn't stop him. He can heal. He does heal. He bridges the gap. You may be 30 seconds of radical courage away from a radical change. Would you take 30 seconds to have a radical conversation with a God who can radically change your life? Jesus travels the distance. He bridges the gap. He shows up in people's lives like Nicodemus. Nicodemus felt like he was miles from God. He was searching for an answer. He didn't have an answer. He didn't know what to do. So he comes at night. To protect his own reputation, he comes at night and asks some questions of Jesus. And his life is transformed. The woman at the well, Jesus comes to her. He shows up for her. He bridges the gap by showing up and has a conversation with her. He asks her the question you heard last week, hey, where's your husband? And she had radical courage to answer the question with the truth and said, I don't have a husband. And he said, you're right. And then he gets brutally honest. Not only are the 5 husbands no longer your husband, but number 6, he's not your husband either. He's brutally honest, and yet, as you heard last week, there was no shame involved. 30 seconds of this radical conversation in the gap where Jesus bridges the gap totally transformed her understanding of who God was. The royal official's at the end of his rope. He has no place to turn. I would have run back home to my son to watch my son die. He stayed and said, Jesus, would you please heal my son? He begs him, would you come and help my son? And Jesus replied, go. Your son will live. Jesus looks at him after saying, hey, y'all, unless you see a miracle, you'll never believe. Go. Your son will live. It's a short phrase in the middle of this whole paragraph, one little phrase. It really is like the hinge on the whole thing. He was able to put his trust into a carpenter from Nazareth. He was a royal official. He was respected. People went to his command. And when Jesus said, go, your son will live, he understood authority and said, you know what? I'm going back home now because you've said my son will live. It says that there was a belief. You see the next phrase, it says that the man took Jesus at his word and departed. He heard the word, he took Jesus at his word, and he went back to his son because he heard that his son would live. That word believe is an amazing word. In the Greek, it's pisteo. It means to consider something to be true. You believe when you consider something is true. But more than that, you then put your trust into that. So you believe it, you consider it worthy to be true, and then it becomes worthy of your trust. So you consider it to be true, and it becomes worthy of your trust. He was in the stage where he was still considering it to be true. It says, while he was still on his way, the servants met him with the news that his boy was living. When he inquired as to the time when his son got better, they said, check this out, yesterday at 1 p.m, the fever left him. The father then realized that this was the exact time at which when Jesus said, your son will live. He believed, he considered it to be true, and so he departed. And then he realized that it was the exact moment that Jesus said that he was healed. He sees the evidence, he puts his trust into it, he realizes the power of Jesus, and a miracle takes place. Now, I like miracles, don't you? Miracles are amazing, but they seem like they don't ever happen, right? Because there's some other weird coincidence why that happened. I've heard that a coincidence is not a miracle. A miracle is when we think a coincidence happens and Jesus chooses to remain anonymous. I mean, I look back and I think, there have been all kinds of miracles in my life. Can you think back to the times where you shouldn't have gotten through that and somehow you got through that? When Kate and I were expecting our second daughter, Kelsey, we got news that her placenta was detaching. The doctor said, go home and rest. She was in the second trimester. How do you rest for 4 months? Well, you rest. But we also realized that rest could only do so much. And we wondered, will this gift be part of our family? And I'm so thankful that my daughter, Kelsey, is here, that Jesus steps in and does amazing things. I love it when I'm desperate and he shows up. The reality is, though, even when he doesn't show up the way I want him to, he still shows up. 2 years later, Kathy was pregnant again. And this pregnancy didn't go full term. We had a horrible loss, a miscarriage that rocked our world. But Jesus was still right there bridging the gap. I don't understand it. I don't get it, but I know that he was there and I felt his presence, and he's the kind of God who shows up because we're not as far away from him as we think we are. Actually, he's not as far away from us as we think he is. He's right there, and he longs to bridge the gap. That's what we've seen in John so far. As we look through the whole series, you'll find story after story after story of people just like me, just like you, who are desperate, and Jesus shows up, has a conversation, looks at you eyeball to eyeball. Here's your story. Asks a question. Challenges you to trust him. And everyone walks away from Jesus changed. There are a few who walked away, but everyone walks away changed. It says because of this story, it's finished with these few words. It says, because he realized the exact moment was when Jesus had said, your son will live, he and his whole household believed. Mere believe. Consider it to be true and worthy of my trust. I consider it to be true and it's worthy of me putting my full trust into. And it's a ripple effect. It's not just about me, it's about the family. Who believed? The whole household. Did the son believe? Apparently. Did the family believe? Apparently. Did the ones who were part of the household who were living there believe? Apparently. The whole household believed. So here's a question as we end. Who do you know that right now feels like they're miles from God? Who in your life feels like God is just, he's so distant? I can't even imagine him having a conversation with me. Who do you know who is desperate right now? And you might say, well, that's me. If you're desperate, if your family is desperate, I want to challenge you. I want to dare you to have a conversation with Jesus, to be bold enough like the dumb 18-year-old I was, writing a letter to God saying, I don't believe in you anymore, I'm angry with you. He probably just looked and said, oh, Scott, you have no clue. But he let me write the letter. 6 months later, I got the letter mailed to me because I put my own address on it, stuck a stamp on it, and it came back. And I looked back and saw what Jesus had been doing in my life that I wasn't aware of sitting on January 3rd, but where he wanted to take me into a new relationship with him. So I want to dare you, would you have a conversation with him? And then would you be willing to be like him and travel? Jesus traveled 85 miles down to Jerusalem to turn tables over and talk with Nicodemus. He went out of his way to Samaria because he wanted to meet with a woman who needed him desperately. He went up to Galilee and hung out with a royal official. The crowd was saying, show us a trick. And he said, go, your son will live. So would you travel? Your traveling might be down the street to that neighbor that you don't like because they don't put their trash cans away. The traveling might be closer, but even harder. It might be down the hallway to that teenager or to that parent who you know right now is desperate. And maybe all you can do is sit with them and listen and pray. Would you travel? Would you travel across the office to that person you talk all about, LeBron James, but you never talk about the real king? Would you be willing to have a conversation? Because Jesus travels, Jesus goes, Jesus moves. He is closer than we imagine, and he bridges every gap. I'm so thankful he's done that in my life. And I'm thankful I'm part of a community who realizes that. If you're new here, welcome. You don't have to have it figured out yet. I don't have it all figured out yet, but I know that he loves me. And that's pretty crazy. Let me pray for us. God, thanks for your love, your radical love that transforms us. Thank you, God, that you're able to do in us amazing things. Thank you that you don't turn away, but you look into our face and you have a conversation. When we're angry, when we're frustrated, when we're desperate, even then you come and sit with us. You are the healer. God, I pray for my friends here who are struggling right now, some who may feel desperate. Lord, would you allow them to see you in the midst of that picture? I know right now it's a chaos and they can't see you anywhere in the picture. It's like you're not even there, but we know that you are there. We can't see you, but we know that you're there. So God, would you remind them? Would you show them a glimpse that you haven't left them and you'll walk with them even through this difficult time? We thank you for your love, Jesus. Pray this in your son's name. Amen.